They say trust is the foundation of any marriage, but I never thought I'd see mine crack wide open. It started subtly, like a breeze before a storm, with Kelly, my wife of 6 years, acting a bit off. First, I brushed it off as stress. She had a demanding job and everyone has bad weeks. But then the bad weeks stretched into months, and her behavior started to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. It was little things. Her phone, which used to lie around the house like a forgotten toy, was now glued to her side. When she wasn't looking at it, it was always face down on the table. Notifications, she said with a quick smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. Then there were the late nights at work, more frequent than ever. Deadlines? She'd explain as she rushed out the door in her best outfits, smelling of a new perfume she hadn't worn before. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something about it felt wrong, like a melody played out of tune. The doubts started to creep in, uninvited and unwelcome. One night, while she was in the shower, I did something I never imagined I'd do. I reached for her phone. My hands trembled as I picked it up, but the screen was locked, and the messages were clean, almost too clean. My chest tightened as I put it back down, guilt washing over me. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just insecure. But the feeling wouldn't go away. A week later, the tipping point came. Kelly said she was meeting her best friend, Cindy, for dinner. "Don't wait up," she told me with a quick peck on the cheek. That night, she came home late, far later than I expected, with an uncharacteristic glow about her. "Did you have fun?" I asked casually, trying not to sound like I was interrogating her. "Yeah," she replied too quickly, her voice too bright. "Cindy says hi, by the way." But Cindy wasn't in town. I knew that because she'd posted photos of herself on vacation halfway across the country. I didn't say anything. Not yet. That was the moment I decided. No more guessing. No more doubts. I needed the truth, and I was going to find it. Once I decided to find the truth, there was no turning back. That night, while Kelly slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Every moment of the past few months replayed in my head like a movie stuck on repeat. The new perfume, the constant texting, the late nights. My gut told me something was deeply wrong, but I needed proof. Not just for me, but so she couldn't deny it when I confronted her. The next day, while Kelly was at work, I took my first step. I bought a small GPS tracker online, the kind that fits discreetly under a car seat. I knew this wasn't the right thing to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had no other choice. That evening, when she went to shower after coming home from the gym, I slipped the tracker into her car. My hands were shaking as I did it, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought she might hear it from the bathroom. The first couple of days, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Her route was exactly what she told me: work, gym, home. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was wrong, if my paranoia had led me down a rabbit hole of mistrust. But then came Saturday. She told me she had errands to run, picking up groceries, dropping off dry cleaning, the usual. I casually asked if she needed me to come along, but she waved me off with a quick, "I've got it. Don't worry." That tracker, though, told a different story. I watched the map on my phone as her car made its way across town, not toward the grocery store or the dry cleaner, but to a small boutique hotel in a quieter part of the city. My heart sank. There was no mistaking it. She wasn't running errands. I got in my own car and drove to the location, parking a block away. Her car was there, just as the tracker had shown, and I waited, unsure of what to do next. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Should I go inside? Should I call her? Confront her right then and there? After what felt like an eternity, the door to the hotel opened, and there she was. She wasn't alone. The man beside her was tall, confident, and far too comfortable standing so close to my wife. They laughed, their heads tilted toward one another, and walked together to her car. My vision blurred for a moment as a wave of anger and disbelief washed over me. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo. I watched as they got into separate cars and drove off, Kelly heading back home like nothing had happened. I stayed in my car for a long time after she left, staring at the photo on my screen. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest, and my mind raced with questions. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? And most of all, how could she do this to me? When I got home, she was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared dinner. Her face lit up when she saw me. "Hey, you're back early," she said with a cheerful smile. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood there for a moment, staring at her, wondering how she could look so happy, so carefree, while my world was falling apart. "Yeah," I finally said, forcing a smile. "Just wanted to spend some extra time with you." Her smile widened, and she leaned in to kiss me on the cheek. It took everything in me not to pull away. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I stayed up replaying everything in my mind and planning my next move. Confronting her would be easy, but I didn't just want answers. I wanted the whole story. I decided to keep digging. The next morning, I acted as though nothing was wrong. Kelly chatted away during breakfast, telling me about a project at work and plans to meet some of her colleagues later in the week. I nodded along, my coffee growing cold as I pretended to listen. Inside, though, I was unraveling. I spent the day at work, trying and failing to focus. The image of Kelly with that man outside the hotel haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her laughing with him, her hand brushing his arm. By the time I got home, I knew I couldn't wait much longer. That evening, as Kelly busied herself with her phone on the couch, I decided to test the waters. "How's Cindy?" I asked casually, my tone light. She didn't even look up. "Good. She's been busy with work lately." "Oh? Have you seen her much?" This time, she glanced up, her brows knitting together slightly. "Not as much as I'd like." "Why?" "No reason," I replied with a shrug. "Just wondering." The answer confirmed what I already knew. She was still lying. Cindy hadn't even been in town. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. If I pushed too hard, she'd get suspicious. Later that night, I checked the GPS tracker again. Kelly had no plans to go out, but I wanted to be sure. Everything seemed normal. Her car hadn't moved since she got home. Still, the paranoia gnawed at me. What if she had another phone? What if she was more careful than I realized? The following day, I decided it was time to dig deeper. I reached out to Cindy, pretending to check in and ask about catching up. She responded quickly, telling me she was still out of town and wouldn't be back for another week. That was the confirmation I needed. But I didn't stop there. If Kelly was lying about her whereabouts, there had to be more. I started looking through our bank statements, hoping for something that could give me a clue. It didn't take long. There were charges from places she hadn't mentioned, restaurants, boutique stores, and one from the hotel I'd seen her at. My stomach churned as the pieces began to fall into place. That night, as Kelly kissed me goodnight and turned off the light, I lay awake again, my mind racing. I had enough to confront her, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what she might say or the faint hope that I was wrong. Whatever it was, I knew I needed one more move before I could face her. I was going to follow her. A few days later, the GPS tracker finally gave me the break I'd been waiting for. It was late in the evening when I got the notification. Kelly's car was parked at a restaurant across town, a place I knew well. Not for business dinners, but for romantic dates. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, debating whether to confront her. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. I had to see it for myself. I drove to the restaurant, my hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. When I arrived, I parked far enough away that she wouldn't notice me. My heart was pounding as I stepped inside, scanning the room quickly. And there she was, seated at a cozy corner table, looking radiant. She was smiling, her face glowing in a way I hadn't seen in months. She wasn't checking her phone or looking restless. She was waiting, calm and composed, as though she had all the time in the world. I slipped into a corner booth where I could observe her without being seen. My stomach churned as I watched her sip from a glass of wine, her eyes darting to the door every so often. She was waiting for someone, that much was obvious. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, I made a decision. I wasn't gonna let her sit there and pretend this was normal. I stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and walked toward her table. Her expression when she saw me was a masterpiece of shock and panic. Her eyes widened, her smile vanished, and she turned pale as a ghost. "Mark?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Hello, Kelly," I said evenly, sliding into the seat across from her. My voice was calm, but inside, I was boiling. "Waiting for someone?" She looked around nervously, as if hoping to find an escape route. "What are you doing here?" "I was about to ask you the same thing," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Who were you expecting?" "No one," she blurted out, her voice shaking. I needed some time to myself. That's all." "Time to yourself?" I repeated. "Support the channel with a subscription, it really makes a difference." My tone dripping with disbelief. "Here? At a place like this?" Her hands trembled as she reached for her glass, but she didn't drink. "Mark, Save it," I interrupted, my patience running thin. "I know. About the hotel, about the lies. So go ahead, tell me. Who is he?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "I swear, Mark, it was a mistake. A stupid mistake. Please, just listen." "A mistake," I echoed, leaning forward now. "You call sneaking around, lying to my face, and meeting someone here a mistake?" "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I wasn't thinking. It won't happen again, I promise." For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. The anger inside me battled with a deep, crushing sadness. This was the woman I'd loved, the one I'd trusted. And now here we were, sitting in a crowded restaurant, our marriage unraveling one word at a time. "You're right about one thing," I said finally, my voice low but steady. "It won't happen again." Her eyes widened, fresh panic setting in. "Mark, please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. Just give me a chance to make it right." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We'll talk at home," I said, walking away before she could say another word. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. The drive home was silent except for the sound of my own thoughts, a chaotic jumble of anger, betrayal, and confusion. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was already parked. She must have rushed home after I left the restaurant. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the house, wondering how I was supposed to face her now. When I finally stepped inside, Kelly was waiting for me in the living room. She looked like a completely different person than the composed woman I'd seen at the restaurant. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face pale, and she was pacing nervously, wringing her hands. "Mark," she said the moment she saw me, her voice trembling. She took a step toward me, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said, my voice flat. "Please, just let me explain," she begged, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's not what you think." I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, folding my arms. "Then explain, Kelly. Make me understand how any of this makes sense. The lies, the hotel, the restaurant tonight. What am I supposed to think?" She hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words, then dropped to her knees right there in the middle of the living room. "Mark, I swear to you, I never cheated on you," she cried. "I know how it looks, but I promise, I haven't been unfaithful. Please believe me." Her desperation caught me off guard, but I didn't let it show. "Then what were you doing? Who was that man at the hotel? Who were you waiting for tonight?" "It's complicated," she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know how to tell you. He's a coworker. We've been working on a project together, and sometimes we meet outside the office because it's easier to focus. That's all it was, Mark. I swear." I narrowed my eyes at her, my skepticism clear. "You expect me to believe that you've been sneaking around with a coworker, meeting him at hotels and restaurants, and it's all just work? Do you even hear how ridiculous that sounds?" I know how it looks, she sobbed, clutching at her chest as if the pain of the moment was physically overwhelming her. But it's the truth. Nothing happened. I've never even thought about being with anyone else. You're the only one, Mark. Always. The sincerity in her voice gave me pause. She was a mess. A far cry from the confident liar I had prepared myself to face. She crawled toward me on her knees, reaching for my hands. Please, Mark. I love you. I know I messed up, but I'll do anything to fix this. I'll quit my job if you want. I'll never speak to him again. Just don't give up on us. I stared down at her, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on me. She looked so broken, so utterly defeated, and for a moment, my resolve wavered. Was she telling the truth? Could I trust her again? You have no idea how much you've hurt me, I said, my voice soft but firm. The lies, the secrets, they've destroyed everything we've built. I know, she whispered, her hands trembling as they clutched mine. I hate myself for it. I was stupid, careless, and I let things get out of hand. But please, Mark, don't let this be the end of us. You're my everything. I can't lose you. There was a long silence as I searched her face for answers, for some glimmer of truth. Her tears fell freely, her body shaking with every breath, and something in me broke. Maybe it was her desperation, or maybe it was the faint echo of the love we once shared. But I found myself letting out a heavy sigh. I'm giving you one chance, Kelly, I said, pulling my hands away from hers. One chance. If I catch you lying again about anything, it's over. Do you understand? She nodded frantically, wiping her tears as a faint glimmer of hope returned to her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I swear, I'll prove it to you. I'll make it right. As she hugged me tightly, her body trembling against mine, I couldn't ignore the small voice in the back of my mind. It whispered that forgiveness might be a mistake, but for now I chose to silence it. For now I chose to believe her. The first few days after I decided to give Kelly another chance were tense, to say the least. There was an unspoken fragility in the air, as if any wrong move could shatter what little was left of our marriage. We spoke carefully, avoiding anything that might stir the embers of our recent confrontation. It was exhausting. Kelly, however, was determined. She bent over backward to show me she was serious about making things right. She canceled after-work plans, started coming straight home every evening, and even deleted her social media accounts. I want you to know you're my priority, she said one night, her voice soft but firm. At first, I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to believe her, to feel like things could go back to the way they were before. But another part of me, the part still nursing fresh wounds, resisted. How could I trust her when everything in me screamed not to? She seemed to sense my hesitance, and instead of pushing, she focused on rebuilding what we'd lost. It started with small gestures. She'd leave little notes for me on the kitchen counter. Things like, "Hope your day goes well," or "Miss you already." She cooked my favorite meals, even though she usually hated spending time in the kitchen. One evening, about a week after the restaurant incident, she surprised me by pulling out an old photo album. We hadn't looked at it in years, but as she flipped through the pages, pointing out memories from our early days together, I felt a small crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. "Remember this?" she asked, her finger resting on a picture of us at the beach. Her hair was wild from the wind, and we both looked sunburned but happy. We spent hours trying to build that sandcastle, and the tide wiped it out in minutes. I nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "And you made me promise we'd come back and build a bigger one," I said. She laughed softly, the sound warm and familiar. "I guess I've always been stubborn." Moments like these became more frequent, slowly chipping away at the tension between us. She suggested we start going on weekly date nights, something we hadn't done in years. At first, I was reluctant. The idea of sitting across from her in a restaurant, pretending everything was fine, felt insurmountable. But she insisted. "I know I have a lot to prove," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm not giving up on us, Mark. Please, just give this a chance." Support the channel with a subscription, it really makes a difference. So I agreed. Our first date night was simple. Dinner at a casual bistro we used to frequent when we were first married. She was nervous, I could tell, fiddling with her napkin and glancing at me to gauge my mood. But as the night went on, we found ourselves slipping into a familiar rhythm. We talked about work, the shows we were watching, even shared a laugh about the waiter who accidentally spilled water on our table. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were two people sharing a life again, not just coexisting in the same house. Over the following weeks, things continued to improve. Kelly started going to therapy, something she'd resisted for years. "I need to understand why I let things get to this point," she told me. "For myself and for us." I decided to join her for a few sessions. At first, it was uncomfortable, sitting in a room with a stranger, talking about the most intimate parts of our relationship. But as the sessions progressed, I began to see things more clearly. We had been coasting for years, taking each other for granted. The cracks in our foundation hadn't started with her lies. They'd been there for a long time. Kelly's efforts didn't waver. She gave me access to everything: her phone, her emails, her schedule. "I have nothing to hide," she said one night, handing me her phone without me even asking. "I want you to feel safe with me again." It wasn't easy. Some days, I still found myself second-guessing her every word, analyzing every action. But other days, I caught glimpses of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the one who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt, who knew exactly how I liked my coffee, who sang off-key in the shower without a care in the world. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, she leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for giving me another chance." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I wrapped an arm around her and pulled her closer. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't in months. A small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. But even as I let myself begin to believe, I knew it would take time. Rebuilding trust wasn't something that happened overnight, and the road ahead would be long and uncertain. Still, for the first time in what felt like forever, I was willing to try. The fragile peace we had begun to build was both comforting and terrifying. Kelly and I were slowly finding a rhythm again, but every step forward felt precarious, as though one misstep could send us back into chaos. Despite her efforts to prove herself, there were still moments when doubt crept in, whispering questions I couldn't ignore. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Kelly reached across and placed her hand on mine. "How are you feeling about us?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. I looked at her, studying her expression. Her eyes were full of vulnerability, a stark contrast to the confident woman I had known for years. "I'm better," I admitted. "But I'm not there yet." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I get it," she said softly. "I don't expect it to be easy. I need you to know how much I care, how much I want this to work." "I know," I replied. "But it's not just about wanting it to work, Kelly. It's about rebuilding trust. And that takes time." She squeezed my hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll wait as long as it takes," she whispered. Her sincerity struck a chord in me, but I still couldn't shake the lingering unease. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, grappling with my thoughts. Part of me wanted to let go, to embrace the progress we were making. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt so deeply, held back, reluctant to fully believe in her promises. Kelly, to her credit, didn't falter. She continued to go above and beyond, looking for ways to show me she was committed. One day, she suggested we take a weekend trip together, a chance to reconnect away from the weight of our daily lives. "I know it's been hard," she said, "but I think it would be good for us to spend some time just being us again. No distractions, no reminders of what's happened. Just you and me." I hesitated. The idea of leaving behind the safety of home, even for a few days, felt overwhelming. But her determination was infectious, and eventually I agreed. We drove to a small cabin a few hours away, nestled in the woods by a quiet lake. The setting was serene, almost surreal, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of calm. Kelly seemed lighter, too, her smile genuine and her laughter unguarded. Over the weekend, we spent hours talking. Not about what had happened, but about us, our hopes, and the things that had brought us together in the first place. We cooked meals together, went for long walks by the lake, and even played board games, something we hadn't done in years. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Kelly turned to me and said, "Thank you for coming here with me. It means more than you know." I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded. For the first time, I felt a sliver of genuine peace, as though the fractures in our relationship were beginning to mend. But peace doesn't erase memory. As much as I wanted to fully immerse myself in this new chapter, the shadows of what had happened lingered. I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding a way to move forward despite the scars. By the time we returned home, I felt more optimistic than I had in months. The trip hadn't solved everything, but it had reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with Kelly in the first place. For the first time, I could see a future where we might actually be okay again. Still, as we unpacked our bags and settled back into our routine, I couldn't ignore the quiet voice in my head. It reminded me that while progress was being made, trust is fragile, and it would take more than a weekend getaway to truly restore what had been broken. For a while, it felt like we were moving forward. The trip to the cabin had been a turning point, a brief reprieve from the tension that had defined our lives for so long. But as the weeks went on, I started to notice changes in Kelly. Small things at first, subtle enough that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. It began with her energy. The warmth and enthusiasm she had been pouring into our relationship started to wane. She wasn't as eager to plan date nights or suggest activities. The little notes she used to leave me on the counter stopped appearing. Her smiles seemed less frequent, her laughter more subdued. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress or exhaustion. She'd been working long hours, and the strain of trying to rebuild our marriage couldn't have been easy for her either. But the more I noticed, the harder it became to dismiss. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I reached out to hold her hand. She let me, but her grip was loose, almost absent. When I glanced at her, her gaze was fixed on the screen, her expression distant. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. She nodded without looking at me. "Just tired," she murmured. I didn't push, but the moment lingered in my mind long after the credits rolled. Over the next few days, her coldness became more apparent. Conversations that had once flowed naturally between us now felt stilted, like she was holding back. She started spending more time alone, retreating to the bedroom early or claiming she needed to focus on work. I caught myself wondering if I'd done something wrong. Had I said or done something to make her withdraw? Or worse, was this a sign that the progress we'd made was unraveling? One evening, I decided to address it. After dinner, as she was clearing the table, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and asked, "Kelly, is everything okay? You've seemed distant lately." She paused, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I'm fine," she said after a moment, her tone clipped. "Are you sure? Because it feels like something's changed." I pressed gently. She sighed and turned to face me, her arms crossed defensively. "Mark, not everything is about us. I've just been stressed, okay? Work has been a lot lately, and I'm trying to keep it together." Her response stung, but I nodded. "Okay, I just wanted to make sure you're all right." "I am," she said, turning back to the sink. The conversation left me uneasy. Something about her tone, the way she avoided my gaze, didn't sit right with me. It reminded me of how she'd acted before, when she was hiding things. As the days went on, her behavior only became more erratic. Some moments, she was warm and affectionate, the Kelly I remembered. Other times, she was cold and detached, her mood shifting without warning. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that she was just going through a rough patch, but the doubts that had taken root months ago were starting to grow again. One night, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling as Kelly slept soundly beside me. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Was she pulling away because she didn't truly want to fix things? Or was I projecting my own insecurities onto her? I didn't have any answers, but one thing was clear. Whatever was happening, we were far from healed. And this time, I wasn't sure if we'd make it through. Weeks passed, and Kelly's behavior remained erratic. Support the channel with a subscription, it really makes a difference. Warm and loving one day, distant and cold the next. I tried to give her space, to believe her claims of stress and exhaustion, but deep down, something didn't feel right. The cracks in our fragile peace widened with every unanswered question, every moment of her pulling away. One evening, while I was organizing paperwork at my desk, I decided to check the GPS tracker on her car. It had become a habit I couldn't seem to shake, though I hated myself for it. For weeks, her routes had been unremarkable: work, home, errands. But tonight was different. Her car wasn't at the gym where she'd said she was going. Instead, the tracker showed it parked in an unfamiliar area on the other side of town, near a quiet strip of boutique shops and cafes. My chest tightened as I stared at the blinking dot on the screen. I told myself it could be nothing, a quick stop, an innocent errand. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and headed out. The drive felt endless, my thoughts spiraling as I imagined every possible scenario. By the time I arrived, my hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I parked a short distance away, far enough that she wouldn't notice me. Her car was right where the tracker said it would be, sitting in the lot of a small cafe that was closed for the evening. The area was dimly lit, and most of the surrounding businesses were shuttered for the night. For a moment, I sat in my car, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself I was overreacting, that I'd find her sitting alone, lost in thought or simply taking a break. But as I approached her car, I saw the unmistakable silhouette of another person in the passenger seat. My heart sank. I stepped closer, staying in the shadows, my pulse pounding in my ears. The windows of her car were fogged, but I could still make out the forms inside. Kelly was in the driver's seat, leaning toward the man beside her. He was turned toward her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. They were laughing softly, their voices muffled but intimate. Kelly reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his face, her touch lingering far longer than it should have. The man leaned closer, his face just inches from hers. I couldn't hear their words, but their body language spoke volumes. There was no mistaking the closeness, the familiarity between them. My stomach twisted as I watched her smile at him, the same smile that used to be reserved for me. I wanted to turn away, to leave before the scene became unbearable, but I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my eyes fixed on the two of them. And then it happened. She leaned in, her lips meeting his in a slow, deliberate kiss. The world around me seemed to blur. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was a choice, one she had made willingly, knowing the devastation it would cause. I stumbled back toward my car, my vision clouded by a mix of tears and rage. I fumbled with the door handle, finally collapsing into the driver's seat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Sitting there in the dark, I replayed what I'd seen over and over in my mind, each detail cutting deeper than the last. The warmth in her gaze, the way she reached for him, the kiss that shattered the last remnants of trust one had left. I didn't know how long I stayed there, staring blankly at the dashboard. Eventually, I started the car and drove home in silence, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me with every mile. When I got home, the house felt colder, emptier than it ever had before. I sat in the dark for hours, my thoughts racing. How long had this been going on? Who was he? And most painfully, why? For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew there was no going back. This wasn't something we could fix, no matter how much she begged or how hard she tried. The truth was undeniable now. My marriage was over. When Kelly came home later that evening, I was already seated in the living room, the lights dimmed. I hadn't moved from the chair since I returned, my mind replaying what I had seen like a cruel, unrelenting loop. She walked through the door with a smile that quickly faded when she saw me. "Mark," she said cautiously, setting her bag down. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stood, my arms crossed, and stared at her. "How was your night?" I asked, my voice cold and even. Her expression faltered, and for a split second, I saw panic flash in her eyes. She hesitated before responding. "It was fine. Just the gym, like I said." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "The gym?" I repeated, my tone sharp. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Her face paled and she took a step back. "Mark, what are you talking about? Don't lie to me." I snapped, my voice rising. "I know where you were, Kelly. I saw you." Her breath hitched, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "Mark, Save it," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want your excuses. I want the truth. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "It was a mistake," she sobbed. "I don't even know how it happened. It wasn't supposed to happen." "That's not an answer," I said, my tone cutting. "How long, Kelly?" She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it didn't mean anything, Mark. I swear, it didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" I echoed, incredulous. "You kissed him, Kelly. You were laughing with him, touching him, lying to me to spend time with him. Don't stand there and tell me it didn't mean anything." She broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. "I'm so sorry," she cried. "I've ruined everything. I don't even know who I am anymore." For a long moment, I stood there, watching her unravel. A part of me wanted to shout, to let the anger and betrayal consume me, but another part felt hollow, numb. "I gave you a second chance," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "I trusted you, even when everything in me told me not to. And this is how you repay me." She nodded through her tears, her shoulders shaking. "Support the channel with a subscription, it really makes a difference." "I don't deserve you," she whispered. "I know that. But please, Mark, don't leave me. I'll do anything. I'll quit my job, I'll cut off everyone. I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you. Just please, don't walk away." Her desperation was palpable, but it didn't move me. "Not this time." "You made your choice, Kelly," I said, my tone hardening. "Now you have to live with the consequences." For the next few days, she was a shadow of herself. She barely slept, and when she did, it was restless. Her once vibrant personality was replaced with a quiet, hollow version of the woman I had loved. Every time she tried to talk to me, I kept my answers short, my emotions carefully locked away. I could see the toll it was taking on her. She cried often, sometimes uncontrollably, and apologized at every turn. "I don't know why I did it," she said one night as we sat at opposite ends of the couch. "It wasn't worth it. Nothing is worth losing you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. But no matter how much she apologized or how much pain she seemed to feel, the image of her with him remained burned in my mind. Watching her crumble was both satisfying and heartbreaking. She was clearly tormented, racked with guilt and shame, but I couldn't let myself feel sorry for her. This was her doing, her betrayal. And as much as she hated herself for it, I hated her more for destroying what we had. But even in my anger, I couldn't help but wonder, was this what I wanted? To see her so broken? Or was it just a hollow victory in a battle where no one could truly win? Kelly's torment only deepened in the days that followed. She seemed consumed by her guilt, the weight of it visible in every movement she made. Her once confident stride had become hesitant, her head bowed as though she couldn't bear to meet anyone's gaze, least of all mine. She tried everything to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. Every morning, she would leave a note on the counter, filled with apologies and promises to do better. "I know I've lost your trust," one note read, "but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it back if you let me." She stopped going anywhere except work and home. Her social life disappeared entirely, as though she was punishing herself for her betrayal. She deleted every app, cut off every contact she thought I might find suspicious, and spent hours cleaning, cooking, and finding small ways to show she was trying. But none of it seemed enough to quiet the storm inside her. One night, I came home to find her sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by photo albums. Her eyes were red and swollen, tears streaming down her face as she flipped through the pages of our life together. "I don't know when I stopped appreciating this," she said, her voice trembling as she held up a photo of us from our honeymoon. "When did I forget how happy we were? How much you mean to me?" I didn't know what to say. The part of me that still cared wanted to comfort her, to tell her that we could fix this, that the love we'd shared wasn't entirely gone. But the anger, the hurt, kept my mouth shut. "You should have thought about that before," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. She flinched as though I'd struck her, her hands clutching the photo tightly. "You're right," she said after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was selfish and I destroyed the one good thing I had. I deserve this." Her self-loathing was almost unbearable to watch. She stopped eating regularly, her appetite disappearing along with her spirit. She barely slept, and when she did, I could hear her crying softly in the dark. It was as though she was crumbling from the inside out, and no matter how angry I was, I couldn't ignore it completely. One night, I found her in the kitchen, sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinets. She was holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold, staring blankly ahead. "Kelly," I said, standing in the doorway. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I don't know how to fix this," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't know how to make you love me again." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. Despite everything, I couldn't deny the raw pain in her voice. She wasn't just sorry. She was breaking under the weight of her own actions. "You can't fix this overnight," I said finally, stepping into the room. "It's not about quick fixes or grand gestures. It's about proving that you're willing to do the work, day by day." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I will," she whispered. "I'll do anything, Mark. Anything." But as I walked back to the living room, I couldn't help but wonder if anything would ever be enough. She was drowning in her guilt, and while a part of me wanted to throw her a lifeline, another part wasn't sure if I wanted to. Watching her suffer didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it might. Instead, it left me feeling emptier, the sharp edges of my pain dulled by the sight of her unraveling. I realized then that forgiveness, if it ever came, wouldn't just be about her. It would be about me, about finding a way to let go of the anger and bitterness that threatened to consume us both. But at that moment, forgiveness felt farther away than ever. The moment of truth came on a quiet evening, weeks after I had seen her with him in that car. Kelly and I had been living in a fragile, hollow routine, sharing the same house but feeling like strangers. Despite her efforts to make amends, something inside me had shifted, something I couldn't seem to repair. That evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the air was heavy with unspoken words. She was picking at her food, her appetite as absent as the laughter that had once filled our home. I stared down at my plate, the words forming in my mind before I had the courage to say them out loud. "Kelly," I began, my voice steady but quiet. She looked up at me, her eyes tired and wary. "What is it?" "I don't think this is working," I said, each word feeling like a stone dropped into a still lake. "I've tried to move past what happened. I've tried to believe that we can fix this, but I can't." Her fork clattered onto the plate as her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mark, please," she whispered. "Don't do this. Don't give up on us." I sighed, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. "I'm not giving up," I said, my voice tinged with sadness. "I just think some things can't be repaired. The trust we had, it's gone, Kelly. And without trust, there's no foundation for us to stand on." She shook her head vehemently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. But I've done everything I can to show you how sorry I am. I'll keep trying. I'll never stop trying. Please, just give me more time. I reached across the table, taking her trembling hand in mine. It's not about time, I said softly. It's about how I feel. And I don't think I can ever look at us the same way again. Every time I see you, I see that night. I see the lies, the betrayal. It's killing me, Kelly. And I can't live like this anymore. Her sobs grew louder, and she clutched my hand tightly, as if trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. I love you, she cried. I love you more than anything. Please, Mark, don't walk away. I stood, gently pulling my hand free from hers. I loved you too, I said, my voice barely audible. But love isn't enough to fix this. I'm sorry. I walked away from the table, her cries echoing behind me as I made my way to the bedroom. I had already packed most of my things, knowing that this moment was inevitable. As I carried my bags to the door, she appeared in the hallway, her face streaked with tears. Please, she whispered one last time. I stopped and turned to her, my heart heavy with regret. Goodbye, Kelly, I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. I hope you find peace. And with that, I walked out the door, leaving behind the life we had built together. The drive to my new apartment was quiet, the city lights blurring as I stared at the road ahead. I felt a mix of relief and sorrow, a strange emptiness that came from knowing I had done the right thing, even if it hurt. In the days that followed, I tried to find my footing again. There were moments when I doubted my decision, when I missed the life we had shared. But deep down, I knew that staying would have only prolonged the pain for both of us. Some things I realized are too broken to mend, and sometimes the only way to heal is to let go. Support the channel with a subscription, it really makes a difference.